slash the heavy iron pen across the thick parchment. The Civil War bled $2 million from the federal treasury every 24 hours in 1862. But Abraham Lincoln chose a solution. He signed the Revenue Act to authorize the first direct tax on individual income. This single stroke of the pen invited the state inside your home to seize your private property. For decades, the American experiment had functioned on a simple, unspoken promise. The government stayed out of your pockets. Revenue came from the borders, customs duties and tariffs paid by merchants and foreigners. But by that sweltering summer, the Treasury was a hollowed-out husk, incapable of sustaining a conflict that was tearing the continent apart. Lincoln knew the old ways were dead. He needed a new weapon, one that didn't fire. He signed the Revenue Act of 1862, an emergency measure that birthed the Bureau of Internal Revenue and forever altered the DNA of the Republic. It wasn't just a tax. It was a surveillance network in its infancy. It established excise duties on everything from stamps to whiskey, and for the first time, it codified a 3% levy on incomes between those earning more saw the state claim a staggering 5%. To the soldiers in the mud of Virginia, this was the fuel of victory, paying for 21% of the total war effort by the time the guns fell silent. But to the citizens back home, it was the first cold chill of a long, dark winter of federal intrusion. The safe house of American privacy had been breached, and the man holding the keys had just handed them over to the commissioner. The Boutwell stepped into the light. He was the first commissioner, the man tasked with building a machine out of thin air. They called it the Bureau of Internal Revenue, a name that sounded like a dry accounting office, but functioned like a clandestine extraction unit. Boutwell began recruiting his handlers. He needed men who could stare down a neighbor. They weren't enough to keep the Boutwell's agents fanned out across the North, moving like shadows through the commerce of a desperate nation. They placed levies on every transaction, every stamp, every plug of tobacco, every bottle of liquor. It was an excise net designed to catch every cent that moved in the dark. Then came the True Blade, the first federal income tax. They pitched it as a patriotic duty, a temporary emergency measure to keep the Republic from shattering. It was sold as a sacrifice for the greater good. The Revenue Act of 1862 established a 3% tax on incomes between $600 and $10,000, rising to 5% for the wealthy elite. It worked with terrifying efficiency. By the time the guns fell silent, Boutwell's machine had extracted enough wealth to cover 21%. It was the ultimate asset. Cold, but as the smoke cleared from the battlefields, the public realized the temporary mask was starting to slip. People were tired of the surveillance, tired of the agents looking over their shoulders at every ledger. But there was one detail that didn't make sense, and no one noticed it yet. The infrastructure Boutwell built wasn't designed to be dismantled. It was built to endure. The people, however, weren't ready for a permanent handler in Washington. By 1872, the domestic pressure became a fever. The betrayal felt too personal. The Civil War was over. The emergency had passed, and the citizens demanded their secrets and their money back. Under intense public scrutiny and the political heat of an election cycle, they repealed the income tax. They told the public the operation was over and that the Bureau would return to the shadows, focusing only on excise taxes for whiskey and tobacco. They pretended the monster had been put down. In reality, the blueprint was simply being moved to a safe house, filed away in the archives of power, waiting for a more convenient era to be reactivated. The betrayal wasn't dead. It was just going deep cover. In 1894, the shadow players in Washington launched a daring infiltration known as the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. It was a precision strike, a 2% tax on any income exceeding $4,000. To the struggling farmer, it looked like justice. To the financiers in New York, it was a declaration of war. They knew the agency was trying to bug their bank accounts, and they were not going to let the surveillance stand without a fight. The Gilded Age elite viewed this as the ultimate breach of protocol. Then came the high-stakes legal standoff that nearly compromised the entire revenue operation. Charles Pollock, a shareholder in Farmers Loan and Trust Company, filed the suit that blew the cover of the 1894 tax. It was a classic counterintelligence maneuver designed to expose the legal fragility of the government's plan. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1895, and the verdict was a devastating blow to internal revenue expansion. Justice Stephen J. Field did not mince words in his concurring opinion. He called the tax a direct assault upon capital and a communist-style breach of the fundamental trust between a citizen and the state. The court ruled the tax unconstitutional, stating it was a direct tax that was not apportioned among the states by population. For a moment, the mission was scrubbed and the files were burned. The Bureau was forced back into the shadows, and the American public believed the threat of a permanent income tax had been neutralized. Everything they believed up to this point was wrong. Behind the closed doors of the Capitol, the internal agents did not accept defeat. They realized that to conduct a surveillance operation of this magnitude, they could not just bypass the law. They had to change the code of the country itself. This was not a retreat. It was a repositioning. They began a decades-long double game, whispering in the ears of both progressives and conservatives, playing one side against the other. They were waiting for the right social climate to pivot from the failed 1894 sting to a deep cover operation. The target was no longer just the immediate revenue. It was the very framework of the Constitution. They needed a permanent entry point that could never be rejected by a judge again. The failure of 1894 taught the collectors one cold, hard lesson. If the front door is locked, you do not keep kicking it. You rewrite the blueprints of the house until the front door belongs to you. The year was 1909, and the handlers in Washington were preparing a classic tactical pivot. William Howard Taft, the 27th U.S. president, knew the public was restless, weary of a system where the working class paid for every government operation through trade tariffs, while the titans of industry kept their fortunes in the shadows. He proposed a compromise that looked like a surrender to the progressives, the 16th Amendment. It was a recruitment pitch aimed at the American psyche, a promise that the federal government would only target the hoarders of massive wealth. Taft was essentially the lead recruiter, selling a contract to the states that seemed too good to pass up. By February 3, 1913, Wyoming became the 36th state to ratify the amendment, and the legal shield of the Constitution was officially dismantled. The wall between a citizen's private purse and the federal vault had been breached, and the agents of the newly empowered Bureau were ready to move in. Woodrow Wilson took the baton as the 28th president, executing the next phase of the operation. On October 3, 1913, he signed the Revenue Act, a legislative trap drafted with clinical precision by Representative Cordell Hull. This was the birth of Form 1040, a 4-page document that forced the individual to calculate their own liability and hand it over to the state, effectively turning every citizen into an informant on their own life. In the beginning, the rates were a carefully calibrated honey trap. They started at a mere 1% for incomes over $3,000, peaking at 7% for those earning over $500,000. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Because it only impacted roughly 1% of the population, the average worker felt safe. They believed the weapon was only aiming at the man in the mansion. They didn't realize they were witnessing the activation of a permanent surveillance machine that was never intended to stay small. This was the soak the rich lie, a temporary class tax designed to normalize a system of total financial visibility that would eventually encompass every paycheck in the nation. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. The year 1953 arrived like a cold front across the Potomac, bringing a total organizational scrubbing. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed Reorganization Plan No. 1, and with a single stroke of a pen, the Bureau of Internal Revenue was effectively buried. In its shallow grave rose the Internal Revenue Service, a title carefully scrubbed of its bureaucratic weight, designed to sound helpful, almost neighborly. But the tradecraft behind this rebranding was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The temporary emergency measure born from the gray smoke of the Civil War had successfully infiltrated the American bloodstream, and now the host was being told the parasite was a vital organ. The betrayal was now absolute. What had been pitched during the desperate years of the Second World War as a class tax, a noble way to trim the excess from the ultra-wealthy to fund the fight against global tyranny, the front lines had shifted from the distant battlefields of Europe to the kitchen table. The surveillance state no longer required grainy microfilm, secret safe houses, or cameras hidden in dead drops. It had something far more efficient: the mandated cooperation of the target. By the time the general public realized the original soak, the rich promise, was merely a legacy shell game, every citizen had been drafted into a permanent financial mobilization with no discharge papers in sight. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Today, the agency functions as an eternal fixture of the state apparatus, processing more than 260 million returns and hauling in. We were told it was a weapon of war meant to protect our way of life. But it became the silent sentry watching every transaction and every dollar. The ultimate double cross wasn't just the seizure of assets, but the fact that we were recruited to be our own informants, meticulously detailing our lives on Form 1040 every April under the threat of federal walls. The shadow wasn't cast by an enemy agent. It was cast by the very hands we elected to lead us. In the shadow world, the deepest betrayal comes from the person you trust the most. Subscribe and hit the bell for more classified stories that were never meant to see daylight. Tell us in the comments, could you spot a double agent in your own life?